Well, hi, friends. This is Doug Reeves from Boston. Welcome to today's webinar on how we can make a difference right now for improved student achievement. All of these slides from today will be available to you, and you can also have a video and audio recording of this webinar that you're welcome to share as you wish. The same is true of all the research and videos that are available at creativeleadership.net. They're free. You can download them. You can share them with whomever you wish. You may have been to some of these affairs where people are cranky about copying slides. I'm not one of those. Research is there to be shared, and that's what I'm about to do with you, including some yet unpublished things for 2018 that I hope you will find of use. So let's get to work. A few learning protocols first. You can use the chat function on GoToWebinar, the question function, or you can text me personally. I realize that not everybody is in front of a computer. If you're just joining us by your cell phone, you can still text to, don't look away from the road while you write this down, 1-781-710-9633. That's 1-781-710-9633. So whether you're in front of a screen or you're on your phone, I value your interaction. And I also want to assure you that this is a safe place for challenges. You know, we're not going to agree on everything. All I can do is share with you the research. And my objective is not to, in 30 minutes, persuade you to agree with me, but rather to persuade you to follow the spirit of empiricism. That is, to be willing to try things, test them, and check out short-term results. You're not going to hear any Stalinist 5-year plans this afternoon. This is about saying, can we make the spring of 2018 better than the spring of 2017 on key variables like improved student achievement, improved behavior, improved attendance. Those are the sort of things that really get people's attention, because when we can do that right, it helps everybody have a better professional life and better life as a student, as a parent, as an educator, as an administrator. So let's talk about some brand new news just released in the last week. Ed Week put together an interesting survey asking, where do people actually get their ideas for changing their professional practice? And of course, the answer was 100% from research journals. No, it was not. 78% are from professional development and conferences, what we're doing right now together. 71% from colleagues, word of mouth. That is why it is imperative that we have teacher-led professional development in which people listen to their colleagues saying, this is what worked for me. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen people who have had the usual band of suspects in asking them to make one change or another. What ultimately caused the change? When they saw a colleague do it successfully. Teacher-focused websites, only about half. Social media, surprisingly, 40%. Now, I want you to just compare that 40% number to the almost 80% number for professional development. If I were to assert without this evidence that Twitter and Facebook and everything else combined, Instagram and so on, were only half as impactful as professional development and conferences, you tell me that I was stuck in the previous century. That is not what 2018 evidence says. Research journals, not surprisingly, only about 26%. News websites, even less than that. The reason I say not surprisingly about research journals is that I think the quality has deteriorated, and honestly, when 95% of hypotheses are confirmed, it doesn't convey much of a sense of independence. I would ask you just to think about this as a critical consumer of research. Beware the researcher who is always conveniently right. You want to have some hypotheses that are not confirmed. You want to have some researchers say, gee, I used to think this, but I was wrong. Here's what I've learned. That's way more credible than simply verifying things that you started out with. So a couple of other things. What's most important to teachers when they're deciding what to implement? Here's some pretty interesting data. 39%, the plurality, say it's got to be evidence-based. 30% said it's got to align with my personal experiences. 13% said it has to be endorsed by my principal or district leadership. Sorry about that. 12% said it's got to be aligned with my state or provincial standards. and my colleagues endorse coming in last. So evidence is really important, and that's what I'm going to try to provide you with this afternoon. So I would like just you to think for a moment and say, based on these slides, what would you do differently in terms of sharing information with your colleagues? And I hope what you'd want to emphasize more are ways to have faculty-led professional development, maybe share not a 30-minute webinar, but maybe at least 5 or 10 minutes of it, where people can get a synthesis of the evidence. And honestly, this makes me a little skeptical of the faith that people seem to place in social media, where my observation is that it becomes an echo chamber. And I'm an active participant in Twitter, but if all you hear is people who agree with you, that is not the critical thinking that our mission and vision statements say that we need. By the way, just a couple of book recommendations that I think are worthy of your consideration that you see up there. I especially want to emphasize those first two, Reclaiming Conversation by Sherry Turkle. She's an MIT professor who says, even at MIT, you got to put down the computer now and then, and you got to be able to actually have a three-dimensional human conversation. And Peak by Anders Ericsson. I will just say this: if you don't have time for anything else, read his one chapter called Gold Standard Practice. You'll never do homework and practice the same way again. So let's talk about some new evidence on old principles. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people here have got a coffee mug that says, another meeting that could have been an email. The evidence from Time, Talent, and Energy, a new book published by Bain, says that we not only waste enormous amounts of time and energy in useless meetings, that is probably no surprise to you, but also that some of these meetings are driven not by the superintendent, who we like to blame everything on, but in fact, one brand new administrative intern can call a meeting that then results in other meetings, that then results in other meetings, that accumulate over the course of time in a mid-sized organization to thousands, if not millions of dollars. Now, I want to ask you, who in your organization has the approval authority to spend $1 million? I'll bet it's not your newest administrative intern, but that is exactly what's happened with the cascading of one meeting after another. 90-90-90, those are the studies that I did that talked about 90% poverty, 90% minority enrollment, 90% meeting or exceeding standards. As you'll see, as recently as the last 60 days, some of those original findings on the power of collaborative scoring, on nonfiction writing, on laser-like focus on achievement continue to be true well into the 21st century. Great to Greater, a new book that will be published along with Jennifer Sparrow, the deputy superintendent at Singapore American Schools, says, what's the difference between those of you who already made great strides? You've done good to great, but how do you get from great to greater? Especially when everything's going well, everybody's happy. I think that's something that differentiates some schools from others on a very high level. Learning styles. I hope you're following Daniel Willingham's blogs, one of the best blogs in education. That's Willingham, just like it sounds. And he has written persuasively that what we used to think about kinesthetic, auditory, and visual styles are simply not true. And here's a good example of where I used to believe in that with my whole heart, and now I've had to admit that I was wrong. New evidence, new studies show that the assessments purporting to diagnose and label a kid as kinesthetic or auditory or visual are not reliable. They are today's kinesthetic kid is tomorrow's auditory kid. Today's auditory kid is tomorrow's visual kid. And finally, multiple intelligences. I received a great note from a professor asking me, well, Doug, can you recommend who will be a foremost critic of multiple intelligences theory? And he was surprised when I said, as a matter of fact, I do know who that foremost critic is. His name is Howard Gardner. And if you've ever seen him, a lot of people don't realize how incredibly modest and self-effacing and authentic he is. When people quote him as if this were settled science, they haven't read his work. When people say, well, Howard Gardner's advocacy for multiple intelligences is opposed to high academic standards, that is the opposite of what he says. He identifies what we've hypothesized and settled, what we've hypothesized and is not yet settled, and what we've theorized that requires future research. That is the modest approach that real researchers take. And people who act as if these things are settled science and continue to insist on learning styles are indifferent to the evidence. So let's talk about, speaking of evidence, new stuff that's happening right now. And I'm talking about in the last few weeks. I was in a high school where the failures, and let me be clear, same students, same parents, same demographics, same faculty, same administration. Failures down 60% compared to the previous semester. Interventions down 67%. Now that's very counterintuitive. You might think that if failures are down, that's because the faculty was working 28-hour days doing all these interventions. And that's the way it felt for the first couple of weeks, because 4 days a week, they have what they call success period. And if you're missing something, we're not going to wait till the end of the semester to tell you about it. If you're missing something, we're going to address it right now. And you are required in a period adjacent to lunch to go to success period. Kids don't like that. How much do they not like this? They dislike it enough to get the work done. So failures were down, and the necessity for faculty to intervene were down even more. I was in a middle school. Absences down 70%, suspensions down 60%, failures down 80%. Same principle for 7 years, same faculty, same student demographics, which was very high poverty and high ELL. What was their miracle intervention? It's not something that they spent $1 million on. They had old-fashioned assignment notebooks where teachers literally had an old-fashioned ink stamp where as you get stuff done, your notebook was stamped. Students are out in the hallway holding their assignment notebooks, and if everything's stamped, you go on your merry way. If it's not stamped, you're directed into a particular room to fix it right now. In fact, at the faculty's request, that went from being 1 day a week to 2 and now to 3. It'll probably go higher than that because it works. And by the way, notice that there is a consistent relationship between decreased failures and better behavior. That's the sort of thing that I think gets all of our attention. I was in an elementary school where absences were down 80%, proficiency in a single year up 30%, and none of this involved buying a program. I want to be really clear about this. These are practices, not programs, that people were able to establish. So let me anticipate what some of the objections are to that always come up from these discussions. Well, that may sound great in theory, Doug, but I know a kid that won't work for. Hey, me too. There are belligerent, indifferent kids. But if in one school that I mentioned, they went from 385 failures down to 15, I would say instead of focusing on the 15 kids that didn't work for, we might want to look at the other kids that it did work for. The kids who are succeeding, people will tell me, are not learning personal responsibility if you do all these interventions for them. On the contrary, when you interview both hiring managers on the job as well as professors at community colleges, and technical skills, one of the key things that they say students lack is the ability to ask for help and to identify when they don't know something, to admit when they don't know something. I listened to the general partner of one of the big 4 consulting firms, and he said of all the things that they look for, whether they're hiring out of high school or hiring out of the college, is students who are willing to admit what they don't know. And a lot of supposedly high-performing students simply can't do that because they've been conditioned to think that asking for help is a sign of weakness, rather than real personal responsibility is knowing when to ask for help. And people will say that passing kids along takes away my personal authority and professional responsibility. And I do respect that. And I do respect that there is a tradition of high standards being equivalent to punishment. But here's the challenging question I would like you to consider. If grading as punishment was effective, because we've been trying that for about 50 years, then right now in 2018, you should be able to tell me that we have the record high levels of work being turned in, record high levels of student compliance with your requests. And I just have to tell you, that is not what people say. It is the equivalent of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, I'll tell you what a fair question is. What's in it for us? What's in it for me as a teacher? What's in it for me as a para, as an administrator? Why change? Well, here's 3 reasons that I can tell you. Better behavior. Every time, every single case study that I've done, bar none, when failures go down, suspension goes down, and behavior improves. And when you think, particularly as we come into the spring, let me tell you who your biggest behavior problems are going to be in April and May. The kids who have lost hope. The kids whose sins of September and January are being averaged into their scores of April and May, and it's too late. They can't recover. They've got nothing better to do than make your lives miserable, and they can be pretty good at it. So better behavior is a good start to improving school culture. But how about this for teachers? More electives. Think, for example, of all the excitement over the eclipse last year. I know science teachers who would love to offer an astronomy elective, maybe even co-taught with a math teacher, but they can't do that because they've got 2 sections of kids repeating 9th grade biology. If we want to get better at that, then the more we reduce those failures in core classes, the more electives that we can offer. The same is true with respect to the large number of students repeating a 9th and 10th grade algebra and 9th and 10th grade English language arts. We reduce those failures, we increase electives, and engagement gets better. Gallup did an astonishing study showing that student engagement drops from 75% in 5th grade down to 32% in 11th grade. It is a steep decline. They're the same kids from the same families with the same teachers. So there's no malice here, but what we can do is when we have opportunities for success and recovery, as we'll talk about in this webinar, we can save these kids from chronic levels of disengagement. So I want to take for a moment the question of the big picture of student evaluation. Is it a standards-based system? We evaluate them based upon their proficiency, or is it a bell curve system based upon their comparison to one another? The country used to be a bell curve, but now it's more based on standards. But take a moment, I'll give you about 60 seconds to discuss with a colleague or think on your own, what kind of a system do you have? Well, what I would argue is that a lot of states claim to have a standards-based system, but then when you see them say, well, too many students are achieving proficiency, or not enough students are achieving proficiency, so let's move the goalpost, all they've done is revert to the bell curve. And in the bell curve, remember, you have the worst of all possible worlds. I may be not really proficient, but as long as I beat that kid in the other city, then I'm going to be validated. Or conversely, I may be very proficient. If I fail to beat that kid in the suburbs, then I'll be regarded as not proficient. It is fundamentally inaccurate. Think about the high stakes areas where we use objective standards, not the bell curve. Like, I don't know, brain surgery, like things like piloting a 777 aircraft. It's not about having fewer crashes than the guy next to you. It's about actually being proficient and having an equal number of takeoffs and landings. And I just think we've got to be back to basics on how we evaluate students. Now, finally, before we get into the details, I want to acknowledge that there are different sorts of views where we disagree. And I value disagreement. and particularly when they're skeptics. Think of the origin of what skepticism was about. Skepticism gave rise to the Renaissance. Skepticism gave rise to the scientific revolution of every century because people challenged previously accepted orthodoxy. And so if you want to challenge me as a skeptic, brother, I respect that. Let's take a hypothesis. Let's agree on what the data is going to be that we'll consider, and then let's test those hypotheses. So if you've got a skeptic who says, I'm not sure about these failure interventions ideas that Doug says is going to work somewhere else, value that. All I'm asking you to take away today is a spirit of empiricism where you'll try it. That is different, however, from a cynic, because the cynic says, I don't care what the evidence says, I'm simply going to oppose you at every turn. And my candid advice to you, colleagues, is value those skeptics. Join with them, even if you disagree, to test hypotheses, but disengage from the cynics because you're not going to get very far with them. So one of the things that I'd like to ask is, what do you think the primary cause of failure is? And by failure, I don't just mean Fs, but I mean Ds and Fs. Take a minute to reflect on these choices, and maybe you've got some others on what the primary cause of failure was in your recent experience, whether it's missing work, poor attendance, inadequate literacy, insufficient preparation. You decide. Tell me what you think the primary cause of failure was. You can use the question function or the chat function on the webinar. So not surprisingly, the verdict is very mixed. Some of you say it's attendance. Some of you say literacy. Some of you say that it's poor preparation. I want to encourage you to do an experiment, and that is take these alternatives and then consider the degree to which each one of those might be true. And once you've done that, you can make a simple little check mark and just do a random sample of 30 students who got D's or F's last semester, or if you're on a numerical system, whatever the lowest number is, take a random sample of 30. You can do this in a 30-minute meeting and just figure out how much of it was missing work, poor attendance, literacy, prior year preparation. I'll tell you that when I've done this work, almost always the highest quantity of the explanation for failure is missing work. Therefore, if that's it, that's something that the solutions that I suggested earlier can really address. If it's inadequate literacy, I'll tell you what I've seen 2 different middle schools who had dramatic improvements in student failure do was to double the time on literacy. They used to, and here's a very odd research observation, they used to have a pretty wide spread as to who was failing and who was succeeding. But nobody ever asked, what were the common elements? You want to know the common elements of the kids not succeeding in literacy? They were the honors kids who only had half the literacy time in 6th and 7th grade as the non-honors kids did. Now, I know that's counterintuitive, but it shouldn't take a federally funded grant to say, if you spend twice as much time on literacy, you'll probably get better results. But the impediment to doing that was, well, there's all this parental pride in my kid's an honor student, never mind the fact that they're not reading on grade level. So I don't want to have them with those other kids. What these principals did was to say, guess what? Everybody's going to get double literacy because we believe that is primary. And yes, I know that means you don't have as much time for some of the other content areas. But ask your colleagues in social studies, in science, what they need most. None of them are going to say knowing the capital of Vermont. None of them are going to say differentiating igneous from sedimentary rock. All of them will say Send me kids who can read my textbook. You'll never go wrong with more literacy. And let me just ask you what the relative risk is. We know what the risk of inadequate literacy is. What's the risk of too much literacy? I guess I haven't seen that risk yet. Now, let's go on to some other issues. I've certainly heard these as well. Inadequate home support, insufficient student self-management. They don't understand instructions, social media distractions. I'm particularly hearing about sleep deprivation because kids are up till 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for the next like or the inclusion of their latest Instagram post. So I get those things. All I can ask is this. Teacher efficacy, what both Bob Marzano and John Hattie have defined as the #1 impact on student achievement, has to do with our bone-deep belief that we can influence the action. So I know that they should have got it done at home. I know they should have been responsible. I know they should have had an intact 2-parent family with nutritious breakfast and enforced bedtime and no media devices in the bedroom. I know that's all should have been true. But that's all in the big basket of stuff I can't control. So I'm going to ask you in the name of efficacy to focus on what we can control. Students don't know self-management from birth. They know executive function and self-management because we taught them that way. They don't know how to understand and follow instructions without our intervention and support. And punishing them for not knowing those things doesn't make it any better. So there's plenty of things I realize we can't control, but I'll tell you what we can control is how we compensate for those things during the school day. And by the way, the same goes for social media. When you've got MIT professor Sherry Turkle saying, give the devices a break. And administrators, I'm talking to you. If you've got a checklist that says, is a teacher using technology? Sometimes the most appropriate response to that is no. The teacher is not using technology because the teacher is emphasizing human interaction and empathy and the ability to listen to and respond to a colleague, not trying to multitask as students think that they can do. So there are lots of other comments, but I want to reassure you that I'm not trying to change the world here, at least not completely. If you want to pursue this discussion with your colleagues, tell them this. We're all on the same side. We want students to have academic success and personal responsibility. So don't hear anything I say about improving feedback policies and grading reform and homework intervention policies as justifying indolence and justifying irresponsibility. What I'm saying is, let's get our consequences right. That's what you saw in those schools that in January of 2018 have dramatic reductions in failures, improvements in attendance, improvements in behavior. And we want this to reflect their real work, not home factors, good or bad, or our sympathy for them. Simply passing kids along doesn't work either. But what I want you to differentiate is the difference between grade inflation and work inflation. Think about it this way. If your school board member were an engineer or electrician, an accountant, a lawyer, a carpenter, they're paid by the hour. And if they went from working 40 hours to 60 hours to 80 hours and got paid more as a result, nobody would call that wage inflation. They'd say, no, they were working harder. They deserve to do better. Similarly, when you see these dramatic reductions in D&F scores, it's not because we're sympathetic. And it's not because we're going easy on them. The students are working harder and as a result ought to have higher grades. And this is an argument that I have relatively frequently with parents and outsiders who have been very comfortable with only a few students succeeding and a lot of students failing. But those students who go from failure to success don't do so by sympathy or coddling. They do so by working much harder. So here are some things that you can do right now. Number one, don't buy all this baloney that you have to change from A, B, C, D, F to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't even know what that's about. The flaws in grading systems are about inconsistency, not the letters or numbers that we use. So if your culture is used to A, B, C, D, F grading, keep it going. If your culture requires a GPA that you report to colleges and scholarship application, keep it going. Just do it the way we've been doing it for about 400 years. and that is an A is a 4, a B is a 3, a C is a 2, a D is a 1, and F is a 0. I'll bet when you were in school, that's the way your GPAs were calculated. It doesn't have to be a 100-point scale. That is an aberration. Just the old-fashioned A, B, C, D, F is the right way to do it. We'll still provide transcripts. You can still have academic honors. Now, I would just add parenthetically, you might consider doing academic honors the way a number of really good schools do, and that is highest honors, high honors, and honors. And you set an objective criteria that I defer to you on how to establish. If you want to say that highest honors is between 3.8 and 4.0, and high honors is 3.6 to 3.8, whatever you decide, then it's objective. And you might have a year in which nobody gets highest honors and a year in which 5 people get highest honors. What you don't have is the silly distinction without a difference that we have right now by saying, well, gee, because we reward only the valedictorian, a 3.99996 is different from a 3.99995. That is a distinction without a difference. You would not let your own statistics students make that mistake. Why should we make it as a system? Just do it the way the Ivy League does. Highest honors, high honors, honors. And for goodness sake, we'll maintain IEPs. When I hear people say that grading reform will threaten IEPs, it's ludicrous. That's a matter of federal law. It's an entitlement. I just want to make the IEPs accurate and meaningful, and certainly preserve them. So, in some gold standards, and then I'm going to take some questions. Grades are part of the feedback, but not the only feedback. One of the most important contributions to the research literature on this was Tom Guskey's report that noted that when students received feedback with a grade, they didn't perform as students who received feedback without a grade. That is directly contrary to most people's hypotheses, because they say, after all, if it doesn't count, they won't do it. That is the same thing that I've seen in schools that have stopped grading homework. Oh my gosh, if you don't grade homework, they won't do anything. Well, actually, if you don't grade homework, they'll do the homework that is worth doing. They'll admit mistakes and ask for help, and most of it will be done during class. That's what Eric Mazur, who you must look up, M-A-Z-U-R, does it in his Harvard physics classes. Kids could go home and do problem sets or maybe borrow them from a roommate, or they can be challenged to get the work done in class, acknowledging mistakes openly and arguing about who was right. We ought to have grading systems that are so clear that students can accurately predict their own grades. But you know what? If I've got 7 different teachers with 7 different grading systems, it is nearly impossible that I will predict the own grades. It would be like going to 7 football games and having 7 different shapes of balls and widths and lengths of the fields. Don't expect the team to perform very well under those circumstances. And they need to be consistent with external assessments. High school colleagues, I'm talking to you here. You can look at last semester's grades and see, were there students who received 4s and 5s on an AP exam and a D in the class? Conversely, were there kids who received honor roll grades, A's and B's, but only got a 1 or 2 on the AP exam? That's the sort of thing that we need to challenge because we agree on what the external assessment requires, and sometimes the internal requirements are wildly inconsistent with that. So, what would you do if you had too many failures, discipline problems, and insufficient attendance? I know what we do. We would, from the federal and state level, require that you fire the principal. That's why high poverty schools can have 5 principals in 5 years. Or fire the teachers. Make it a condition of a grant that we replace half the staff. We can bus in new students. That's my favorite. Yes, let's get rid of the bad ones and bust in new ones. We could get a grant and buy 12 new programs and implement them simultaneously, which means essentially not at all. Or we can identify 1 or 2 high leverage practices, monitor their results, and see what happens. Here's what happened in one school, very similar to the results that you've seen before. Look at how the Fs went down from 385 to 15, how the suspensions were cut in half, how attendance went up. What did they do? If you're missing work, you don't wait until the quarter or the semester. Every Thursday evening, we know who's missing work. And if you're missing work on Friday morning, you don't go to class, you go to the catch-up room. where in their vernacular, you catch up. Now, would it have been better if they got it done at home? Sure, but they didn't. And look at what happened. And I know what you're thinking. Well, Friday morning, they're missing Friday morning instruction. Friends, look at those 385 students there. They were also missing Friday morning instruction, even though they were sitting in class. You have these interventions, and there are many, many variations in the theme that lead to have students catching up. And the latest update is more than 300 students moving in. This is in a choice state, saved the school $1 million. They continued their growth and the best faculty morale in decades. Now, there's many, many variations on this theme that I've written about in some of my work, like elements of grading and fast grading, that I don't need to detail now, except to say they all involve real-time and immediate intervention. And all I'm asking you to do is choose just one solution, just one that might be worthy of intervention for you. So when nothing else works, you've given students every opportunity. What do? It's still okay to give a 0. Just do the 0 on a 4-point scale, not the 100-point scale. And here's how you will persuade your colleagues to do this. If they did A work, they'll get an A, which is equal to a 4. They do B work, they get a 3. C work, they get a 2. D work, they do a 1. But what did they get? If they don't turn anything in, you'd give them a 0. And I'm okay with that. But nobody on this webinar said, let's see, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. But if they don't turn the work in, they should receive a -6. That's absurd, isn't it? Nobody thought that they should get a -6. But that is the mathematical logic you would have to apply when you say A is a 90, B is a 80, C is a 70, D is a 60, but not turning it in is a 0. Saying that not turning it in is 6 times worse than a D is mathematically inaccurate. So I'm asking you to evaluate the work that you have, assess them where they are, and if you still need to give a 0, don't make it the academic death penalty. Do it on a 4-point basis. So here's the way to open the conversation with your colleagues. Ask what it would be like if we had fewer failures, if we had fewer repeaters, if we had more elective offerings, and if we had fewer discipline. What would that mean for the culture and morale of your school? So I know there's risks. There's risks of opposition. There always is from changing. And so when people say, well, Doug, you've got to get buy-in from everybody first. No, you don't. Behavior precedes buy-in. Changing in results and experience precedes belief. And so this old change model, widely discredited now, that says you got to get buy-in first, is a guarantee that you will never change. What instead we ought to have is the question, are we willing to give it a fair shot and experiment with it? So here's the summary of the things that we've discussed. Excuse me. And the time that we have left, I want to give you the opportunity, I beg your pardon, for some discussion and questions. So I'm going to look at those right now and respond to them briefly in about the next 7 minutes. So this is really an insightful comment. Someone said, I feel that poor attendance is due to inadequate literacy, and both can perpetuate the problem. Exactly. It would be nice if we could say, well, if they'd only show up, then they do better. But the reason that they don't show up is that they feel helpless. And they're smart. They know when coming to school has no impact at all. So it's success first. That leads to better behavior, better attendance. Self-management is the root of many of these items. Brother, are you right about this? That's why that school that had that simple solution of every single student using the same assignment notebook, it's not optional. They walk through the hallways with it open, showing their department chairs, showing every administrator, showing security personnel. Here's how my evidence is that I've earned my freedom because my work is complete. But they learned that self-management by practice, not by having it before they walked in. Another of you said, I recently read a noted middle school expert's post who talked about not having a middle school honor roll in an effort to not separate kids at a time when we want them to feel like they are belonging to a group. I'm not sure that I buy that. I think kids respond very well to positive recognition. The key is to make the honor roll meaningful and not a matter of gamesmanship. Tom Guskey always uses the example of earning honor roll grades for bringing in extra credit and Kleenex. The issue is how do we recognize effective and excellent work? For example, and let me be really specific about 2 middle schools that I've seen do this. It's not just the honor roll. That's a piece of it. But putting outstanding student work, mean great math problem solving, a terrific lab report, a wonderful essay, a great piece of art, maybe a student musical composition displayed in the trophy case. Because in a secondary school, the trophy case is the place of honor. It shows what you value. And if the only thing you see there is athletic trophies, you need to build another trophy case to show what you really value. And besides, I think the illusion that we don't know who's doing well and who isn't is kind of like we shouldn't keep score at Little League games. Let me let you in on a secret. The kids keep score. They know who's winning and who's losing, and they make fun of this everybody gets a juice box idea. So I think we can be simultaneously rigorous and reassuring, and I'd honestly be skeptical of the person to whom you are making reference. How do you get teachers to stop taking off points for late work regardless of quality? Here's how I've seen it done, and I wish I could say it's because of an inspirational speech from Doug Reeves. That actually didn't work, but I'll give you a real case study where I did see it, and that was a teacher who wanted to change this. She was a high school English teacher, but the rest of her department didn't agree, and she said, could I do an experiment? And so she had a load of about 120 kids, and she did 2 things. She went to the 4-3-2-1-0. She stopped using the average, and so the work was graded based upon its quality, not when it was turned in. She went from 28 failures in one semester to 4 in the next. Same kids, same teachers, same curriculum. And here's what's really interesting, because they all had the same end of course assessment, you could test the assertion, well, is she just engaging in grade inflation? No, the quality of the work, the quality of the student's knowledge was the same. The number of F's went down. So here's the question I'd ask you. What would happen in your school if you had 24 fewer failures in a single course? That's a whole section of repeaters you don't have next year. And this woman, whose name is Brooke, gets to teach an elective because she had fewer failures. Not because she was easy on them, but because the penalty for not turning the work in is doing the work. Well, my time has expired. I really want to thank you for your outstanding participation today. This is one of the best attended webinars we've had. And also, I put my personal text and phone number up there for a reason, and that is that those of you who know me know that I'm very responsive, including small group and one-on-one discussions, including videos or webinars or just chats on the telephone. I'll be taking off for Asia on Saturday morning, so I've got a lot of time to answer emails and to converse with you, and my phone works all around the world. So take me up on that offer. Thanks so much for your kind attention today. Have a great rest of the week.